Typewriter Beach is set in 1957 and 2018, Carmel by the Sea and Hollywood. And it tells the story of a blacklisted screenwriter and a starlet whose studio wants her to be the new Grace Kelly if she can toe the line. And then in the contemporary story, 2018, the blacklisted screenwriter's granddaughter comes back to clear out his cottage and finds in the process a mysterious manuscript buried in a safe hidden in his closet that nobody knew existed. Well, the studio contracts were quite amazing. They were 7-year contracts because that is what the labor laws allowed. You could not basically indenture somebody for more than 7 years. But they had a tremendous control under the actresses and actors' lives. So the contracts could require you, for example, to have plastic surgery that the studio thought you needed. They could require you to do whatever films they wanted to do. They could loan you out to other studios to do the other studios' films, and this was pretty lucrative. So, for example, Alfred Hitchcock, when he first came to Hollywood, he was under a contract, and the studio ended up doing one film with him and then loaning him out for a whole bunch of films. He was still paid his contract rate, and the studio kept all the additional funds from him being loaned out. And that was very typical. That was the way it worked during the studio era. And as you can imagine, your reputation at the time, especially as a woman, was very important. And so there were things like morality clauses, where if you were caught in a married relationship or something like that, you would be out. So Leo is kind of, for me, where the story started. I have long been fascinated with the blacklisting of people in Hollywood during, they call it the McCarthy era, but actually McCarthy's era was much shorter than the blacklist era, which started in the 40s and went on into the 60s. But this idea that government could step in the form of a congressional committee and silence voices, basically decide who would be allowed to write and who wouldn't, was horrifying at the time, and so that's what drew me into the story. The story really started with Leo, and then I have long been fascinated with the role of women and the treatment of women in Hollywood. I've been writing opinion pieces for the LA Times and Washington Post and elsewhere since probably 2012 or so, before the Me Too movement took place, talking about the fact that women don't get to direct, and a young white man especially will be given opportunities that a very experienced woman of color will never get, simply because the people doing the hiring are looking for people who are like them. So that's something, all my novels have had at some angle a theme about the particular challenges women face, and that is one of the particular challenges that women face in this particular novel. I'm fascinated with the 1950s. I lost both my parents recently, and my mom and I were very different personalities and didn't meet in a lot of places, but one of the places we did meet was watching old Hitchcock films together. She was my introduction to that world, and she was a woman of the 50s, and so to a certain extent I'm exploring her life when I explore this era. But it's an interesting era because we look back on it now and we think, oh, the 50s and happy times and happy days and all that kind of thing. But it did have this very dark underside and this kind of snapback from women during the war. Their labor was needed, and so they had all sorts of opportunities. And in the 50s, after the boys came back from the war and needed the jobs, the women were all expected to leave their jobs to the men and go back to being homemakers. And it was a time that, I mean, I know my own mother she had to quit working when she was pregnant with my brother, and she hated that. She had loved working, and it was sad that she never really got to go back to work after she started having a family. So I think it's an interesting time to explore. So Gemma is a 20-something-year-old screenwriter in 2018. She's, trying to fill her grandfather's very big shoes. He was a very successful writer as a young man. He was Oscar nominated a couple of times before he was 30, even though he comes from a difficult past and had a difficult time even getting to Hollywood. Gemma is, in some senses, a natural heir of Hollywood because she's his granddaughter, and yet she's having a hard time finding purchase, getting a career started, as so many of us do. And so she comes to Carmel by the Sea. You're talking about the setting. The setting is primarily of the book, even though it's a Hollywood book, the setting is primarily Carmel by the Sea. And Gemma comes back to tuck away her grandfather's life and sell the cottage. And in the process, I think, like many good novels, and I hope this is a good novel, comes to know the secrets of the family she comes from, and she comes to know Isabella Giori, who lives next door to her grandfather at that point in time. And she meets a charming young video game maker across the street, in the mansion across the street as well. So I hope it does contrast what Gemma goes through, which is nothing compared to what Isabella went through. She doesn't have a 7-year contract, and yet, she might give up 7 years to have a contract, because she wants to write. And she faces a slightly different Hollywood, but a Hollywood that still does treat women differently. And so there are, progress comes, but it comes slowly. I met some women working in Hollywood some time ago and became very interested in the challenges they face. And so I started poking around about it, interviewing people, writing about it. When I first started writing about it, one of the pieces that I pitched was it started with looking at who is Oscar nominated in terms of directors and things like that, which is mostly men, mostly white men, and still is. And so I started poking around in that because I do think that the way that the people who tell stories, shape the stories we are told and therefore shape our society. So I started poking around, and I found at the time many, many women who would talk to me off the record, and very few who would talk to me on the record, because it would jeopardize their future. They wanted to direct, or they wanted to act, or they wanted to do whatever. And if you spoke out against the patriarchy, you would no longer be welcomed by it, I think was the fear, certainly. And it was interesting to see people start to speak out, especially after Harvey Weinstein, that whole story came out. And since then, there's been a lot of outspokenness and support of women in Hollywood. And I think it will, over the long arc, change things. Certainly more women are directing now than they used to. Certainly more women have good roles than they used to. Although, the 50s had some pretty good female roles too. It was not a bad time for women actors in terms of the roles they got to play. So that's where it comes from. It comes from as the best writing does, I think, comes from a long-standing passion and years of research that, until you asked that question, I hadn't really focused on how much they inform the novel.